When we were last together, we talked about big business making America great during the Second Industrial Revolution. We talked about all the ways they pursued profit and how they would go through and do just about anything to make that profit. Whether it was robber barons working on the railroads, or whether they were using horizontal integration like John Rockefeller, or vertical integration like Andrew Carnegie, the profit motive was their number one goal. It was the one thing they were after. What we didn't talk about was that unions were developing to protect the worker, because nothing we've talked about so far in this chapter has talked about how workers are doing in these factories, because there's a reality here is that there's a need for a union, and what you need to do here is understand that a union is there to protect the workers. That's really important, because at the time a whole bunch of things were happening. Prices were falling, and because they were, companies were cutting your wages. And workers are upset about this. They were working so hard. Why are their wages getting cut? On top of that, they're doing it in unhealthy conditions. The work itself is dull and repetitive. It's terribly unsafe. So what we see are workers trying to strike back at these businesses who care only about profit. So they use strikes. And when you strike, you just stop production. That's all it means. It means you just stop working. The goal is to manipulate your employer into paying you more, giving you better working conditions, making things safer. Employers, on the other hand, said, well, if you're going to strike, we're going to lock you out. We're going to use lockouts, and we're just going to refuse to pay you. You don't want to work? We're not going to pay you. That should break up existing unions, right? If you need the money, you need the job, and we're just going to hire replacements who don't join a union. A lot of this really ends up in the courts, and it's unfortunate because the courts at the time really support the employers, because there was nothing at all in the law that said you could actually have a union. So we have, during the first part of the Second Industrial Revolution, and even during the second for that matter, a lot of tension rising between workers on one side and employers on the other. And what we'll see is that tension will spark and it'll explode in violence. For example, the Great Railroad Strike happens in 1877. It's the first nationwide protest, and 100 people are killed. There's $10 million in 1877 dollars in damages, and we actually needed to use the army. We had to use troops to restore order in 3 different states. It was catastrophic when you really consider that our nation depended on railroads to make this happen. The only thing I can really think of that would help you understand how crazy it would be is if every trucker and every airplane in America stopped moving today because those workers were striking. Nothing would get done, and the economy would collapse. Another good example of where workers strike back is in Chicago. It's something called the Haymarket Riot. And workers in Chicago were so upset. They just wanted an 8-hour workday. And so they're willing to fight the Chicago police over getting this 8-hour workday. And 10 police officers are killed, 170 workers are killed, violence breaks out. It's a mess. It's an absolute mess. The last example I'll give you that happens during the first part of the Second Industrial Revolution is the Pullman strike. And this strike is just really, really hard on the workers, because the Pullman Rail Company was the largest railroad car maker in America. And they cut wages again and again and again. And the workers were struggling just to get by. On top of that, Pullman owned all of the houses and all of the stores the workers had to shop in and had to live in. You see, if you worked for Pullman, you had to live in a house that he gave you, in a town he built, and shop at a store he made. So he's cutting your wages, raising your prices, and it's really putting you in a hard place because you don't have enough money and you can't get out of the job because you need it. I want to introduce here too, since we've talked about kind of this clash between workers and employers, a group we haven't really talked about in terms of as workers, and that's going to be women. because women at the time, they were really forced into something known as women's work. And the way this work is, that women's work were stuff that people thought only women could do effectively. Teachers, servants, clerks, office workers, nurses, these kinds of things. And the reality is these women were paid less for quality work because they just assumed, society assumed, that women had men at home to support them. That prejudice is still felt today because women, on average, still do not get paid the same as men for the same amount of work in the same job. Women, even as early as the Second Industrial Revolution, even as early as 1870s, 1880s, they formed their own union. The Women's Trade Union League, the International Ladies Garment Union, all of these are formed. The Trade Union League, for example, is the very first one that was dedicated to women's labor issues. And this idea was that women have a right to all the same things men do in the workplace. Now, we'll talk more about this in particular when we're in class, but we'll also dabble with some of these other larger issues of workers and employers as well.